Hello, and welcome back to the Simplifiers podcast, where we take topics in work and in life and simplify them. And I'm a little bit nervous, you guys, because I have a feeling we're going to offend at least one person out in the world that listens to this episode. And for all good reason. Let's just say, put yourself forward as the tribute, because I think when we talk about hard topics, we all learn together. And today's hard topic that we're going to simplify is, okay, well, here goes. How to tackle mansplaining in the workplace. And I had to find the exact right guest for this exact topic. And her name is Dr. Kimberly DeSimone. She's a doctorate in leadership and a gender equity expert, an award-winning professor and scholar, an executive coach, speaker, author, and creator. And hey, she's also a podcaster, the host of the Advancing Women podcast, where ambitious women come together to challenge the status quo, advance their careers, and up-level their lives. She's got decades of experience working in the Fortune 500 companies around the world and also conducting evidence-based research on women navigating the leadership pipeline. So I'd like to welcome to the Simplifiers podcast, Dr. Kimberly DeSimone. Hey, Dr. Kimberly.
Hi there. Thank you so much for that great introduction. I appreciate it, and it's great to be here.
It's so much fun to interview other podcasters. Can I just say that out loud? I have a feeling we're going to have a great time in this conversation. And like I said, we might piss off one or two people that are listening.
It does occasionally happen, when you tackle, as you said, the tough conversations, but these are important conversations to have. And I bet you'll find that people are really going to see how this resonates, both male and female alike,
yes,
when they take it a little bit deeper and simplify it a little bit.
Oh, totally. Well, and this is the thing, is there are cultural phenomenons that are happening and, new buzzwords every single year that get added into the dictionary, right? And this is one that got added kind of recently. So maybe sometimes people just don't know what it is. So let's start there. Let's define what is mansplaining and how is it different from someone, say, just being condescending or an interrupter?
Yeah, I love that question. And I think it's so important because we really do need to be clear on what mansplaining is and what it is not. Because if we see mansplaining as kind of synonymous with being condescending, then you get those responses like, well, what about womansplaining? And so we have to deconstruct the term and do a brief inventory of the power dynamics, right? Because nobody's claiming that women never condescend. Women can be condescending too, of course, but retorting with, what about womansplaining, is really a failure, I think, to acknowledge a historical context, the history of men speaking for women in all domains, politics, government, the media, creating laws that govern our country, right, and still often the quote unquote rules that persist in the workplace for leadership. And we have to kind of think about that historical context because it matters. And so I always say, mansplaining is not synonymous for condescension. Of course it isn't, okay? It is condescension, but also where that meets power, bias, historical privilege, and dominance. And we have to take that into consideration as well.
Yeah. And I mean, let's just face it. You and I are two Americans having this conversation, but this is a global phenomenon. It's not just based in the States, right?
Absolutely. There is no history in the United States, or anywhere else of women having voice when men did not. There is suffrage in America and other countries for women to earn the right to vote or drive in some countries. As you said, it's very different. But we don't have a history of men having to earn, of men having to fight for, or of women speaking for men and on their behalf. And yet we have constitutions and governing bodies in all countries that were really developed by men for all, where men have been speaking for women for a long time and not the other. So you have to keep that in mind. And I would say even for our best allies and the men who say, oh, this is nonsense, I'd say, well, think about it really. Think about how unlikely it is for a woman to speak for a man versus men to speak for women, because we've historically just experienced that for a really long time. And we also have a culture that says, and has said for a long time, that, men are the default. Men are the kind of experts in situations, and women have had to fight to say, no, actually we are. And so this is kind of the antecedents of all of this and how this all comes to be. And if you really break it down, then you start to see it in a little bit different of a light.
Yeah. And hello, if you need a data point of evidence, I'm based back in Texas now, where women's reproductive rights are being decided by mostly white men in power in our government. And I mean, this is in modern day. This isn't 40, 60, 100 years ago, which it was back then too, but it's right now.
Yeah, I think one of the most dangerous, kind of insidious problems with bias is when we have this kind of false fallacy that it's fixed. That is a really dangerous mindset. If I go back to 1900s and I think about women fighting for the right to vote, they knew, and everyone knew, they did not have these rights. We knew that there was this kind of distinction and this inequity, but today there's this kind of false fallacy, that this misnomer that we fixed it and that the problem is behind us. And I think that can be really dangerous, especially for younger people who go into the workforce or the world believing that these problems are behind us and that they're not going to come in contact with it. And I think that's a big part of what we're doing here today, is saying you will likely encounter this type of backlash or these types of biases. And perhaps today they are more implicit versus explicit. But that in some ways makes them a little bit more dangerous. I sometimes joke that I liked good old fashioned gender bias that you could see and call out and fight head on, as opposed to this kind of hidden bias, this second generation gender bias that's sneakier, that kind of is implicit, but doesn't really come out and say it outright. And so you're left kind of scratching your head going, it's just, something's not right here. But yet there's also this messaging that tells me it's all fixed and it's all solved and yay, we've got it and we've made it and we've kind of arrived. And so you're absolutely right. We have to just, keep fighting the good fight and not think we're there, because we are not.
Well, and that's it. We're just having hard conversations, talking to other people that look nothing like us, think nothing like us. That's how evolution happens. And I think you put it very succinctly as the litmus test is that women have never spoken for men historically. Just think about that in your local culture, your local government, your national government. Have you ever thought of an example? And I guess I just that thought never really occurred to me until you put it that way. And I'm like, oh, huh.
Yeah, we've never had voice for men. We've never had power over men. And today in America, in 2021, we still find that most positions of power, privilege, pay, and wealth are held by men. And so almost 90% of the world's wealth is still held by men, and most positions of power. So we still have this power dynamic. And therefore, we have to take these distasteful social constructs and these behaviors, we need to name them.
Yes.
So that we can hold them up to the light, call them out, and interrupt them.
That's it. Right. You have to acknowledge that this is a thing in the room, in order to start to break it down. And I mean, this is the thing that I don't quite understand is why do some people, both men and women, let me just put that out there for the record, but why do some people discount the concept of mansplaining when it occurs?
I think it is that oversimplification of complex thinking, which is to say, first of all, let me take a step back and say, whenever the power structure is challenged, whenever historically the dominant power structure is challenged, it fights back. And it may do so on a subconscious level. It may do so on an unconscious level, but power is never given. It always has to be taken. And people don't like to have to kind of take a step back and say, I've got to change my behavior. So that's...
Yeah, because no one likes to change.
Yeah, people don't like to change. And quite honestly, deep down, you have to know on a subconscious level it's working for you in some cases, for some people. So even well-meaning, even allies sometimes can not understand this is happening, but also they may not intentionally be mansplaining, but because of other biases, it has the same impact. So for example, if a man interrupts you, it's different than if you interrupt a man. Now, it may not feel that way, and he may not feel like he can interrupt you because he has power over you or he's in a position of expertise that you're not. But when you have the science and the evidence that shows that women are interrupted more often, that when they are interrupted, they're more they're more likely to concede the floor, that men do not concede the floor when they are interrupted, that men's ideas are more likely to be seen and heard and acted upon, and that men are more likely to be seen as the expert. They have to recognize that. A man has to know, a male ally needs to know that when he comes in with challenges towards your expertise, that he is doing so within a larger historical context, not in his own, perhaps very innocent, unmeaning to cause this problem. And so that's part of the reason of having the conversation, is saying the way we behave lands differently. The way men behave lands differently when the way that they behave is in interaction with a woman.
Yeah.
So if he interrupts a man, it's different than if he interrupts a woman. When a woman behaves in a particular way, it lands different than if a man did. And there is one study after the other that confirms that. So we know this, right? And I love how Maya Angelou says, do your best until you know better, then do better. And I'm saying the purpose of these conversations is I'm wanting to help people know better, even well-meaning allies, women, young women who believe that we are, at the kind of top of the mountain, that we've reached that echelon where we don't have to, you have to just say, okay, let's just really be honest about this so that we can know better. And if we know better, then maybe we can all do better.
Yeah. And what I hear in everything that you just said there, and I really appreciate you breaking it down like that, if I can interject a sports analogy, which is very, very uncharacteristic of me, so I'm just going to go with it. But it immediately kind of made me think, like, if people, male or female, are playing, say, baseball, they understand the rules of the game and they understand the rules of the field, and they just go, well, this is it. This is the petri dish. This is the field that we play in. That's how it works. And if all of a sudden somebody starts kicking the ball rather than throwing the ball, you can go, hang on, this is not working for me. But I think to your point also is the power struggle of it. If I could move over to a different analogy of, like, who's steering the ship, even if the ship is broken, I still want to be the one holding the steering wheel, and you're threatening my power of how this ship gets steered, right?
Yeah, I think two things. I love sports analogies. So to go back to your sports analogy, I think that if you look at any sport or life, there's a set of written, overt rules that are what drive the game. But there's also a set of invisible rules, unwritten rules, implied rules, little nuances that people who truly know the game, who study the game, understand, well, they never call that. They never do that as long as you do this thing. The tie goes to the runner, and some of these things that you see in sports. But in leadership and in the workforce for women, there's a host of unwritten, invisible rules that exist because we are gender socialized from birth to understand that we have expectations of kind of prescriptive biases for what women should be like and men should be like, and descriptive biases that say this is what women and men are like. And whenever women or men behave in ways that are not aligned with those kind of social expectations and norms, there's going to be backlash.
Right.
And now you have this history of man is expert, man as default, right? And there's a term called Androcentrism, which is the idea, and it's well researched, that the male vantage point is the default. And so, if that is the way you're coming at things, and that's the way it's always been, you have to recognize as a man sitting in a room that when you speak, you have a little bit of unearned extra oomph behind your, sorry, I don't have a better, more intellectual word, but there's a little more oomph behind what you're saying because, we've got think leader, think male theories. We know that expertise is kind of defaulted to male and that we have to interrupt those bias patterns. And when we know that, then we have to understand that everything we do puts us at a kind of unlevel playing field in that room. And therefore, everyone has bad behaviors in the workplace. But when men have bad behaviors, they impact women more severely. Yeah. It is more harsh for women. And when women make mistakes, conversely, we also see harsher. So if you call out a spelling error on a male colleague, that's going to, kind of roll off everyone's shoulders. But then when you look at research that shows that women's mistakes are more highly punctuated and remembered, it makes you think a little bit more about, should I call that mistake out? Because the consequences for my female ally, whether I'm a woman or a man, the consequences of correcting her or calling her out or interrupting her or inserting my pseudo expertise against her expertise are very different. They land different. And if I'm mindful of that, then maybe I make a little bit more thoughtful choices when I'm interacting in that environment.
Yeah. And I definitely want to deep dive into the subtle nuances between mansplaining that happens, say, with a prospective client towards you, or a vendor or supplier on your, or even an internal, like an employee or a subordinate. Like, I think there's nuances to how you tackle that, how you handle it. But I think it begs the reason to ask this question at this juncture now, too. I feel silly saying this out loud, but I think it's important. So how does mansplaining work if you're non-binary or trans?
Okay, so I think that's a really interesting question, but I think when I go back to my prescriptive biases and descriptive biases, that we just have to understand, and I'll try to simplify it, that we live in a world where there are some very strong, pervasive, and lasting internal ways that we process behaviors that are gendered, deeply gender entrenched. And so therefore, and the research supports this, there's tons of research that shows how, women and feminine traits. And when I say feminine traits, I mean the traits that society has deemed that which is female. And so, we all are on a spectrum of masculine to feminine traits in terms of the stereotype, but those words you would expect, like aggressive, assertive, confident, which are those kind of agentic male trait stereotypes that we and when I talked about backlash, right, like the more men behave that way, the more aligned that is with our very subconscious perceptions of what we expect men to behave like. Right. And women, on the other hand, are nurturing and cooperative and helpful and deferring in some cases. And so we have all of this wrapped up. And so no matter where you fall in terms of your sex, your biological sex, you're probably on a wide spectrum in terms of that gender expression. And so we're really talking about gender expression here. And no matter what the packaging comes in, society is going to expect and want to see, to some degree, the gender expression they expect. And so anyone who expresses that differently than the stereotype is going to feel that. And so there is actually not a huge body of research, but a growing body of research in the transgender community, in that community of people who have actually had transitioned from male to female, particularly talking about, from a very interesting and unique vantage point, the experience of living a life as a woman with the same brain and the same expression of personality and kind of traits, and then living as a man with the same expression of and kind of traits and things of that nature. And I think you see it across the board. There is backlash when we behave in ways that are not aligned with incredibly well-entrenched stereotypical gender biases that we are socialized in from a very young age. And with all of that happening, it just means that even the best of us who are trying to work through it, and I want to be clear because I think it's really important that people not see bias as evil or bad.
Right.
Bias is a product of being socialized, gender socialized from before birth even. There are studies that show that when you're in the womb, a woman finds out she's 15 weeks pregnant and she's talking to the baby different than if she knows it's a boy than if it's a girl, and same with the external world. So we are almost immediately, if not before immediately, telling people this is what we expect of you. And whenever we behave in ways that don't, that's going to, cause that kind of disconnect and that backlash. And so, yes, you'll see it in any place where the expression of traits and behaviors is not aligned necessarily with the historical context of the expectations that are so deeply well entrenched.
You're rocking the boat or you're messing with my baseball game, and I don't know if I can handle that, right?
That's exactly right. And also, who wrote the rules and who do they then work best for? And it's not knocking anybody. You write the rules with the information you know. It's the quote I said before. Right. You do your best until you know better. Well, now we have more people, more voices, more people with neurodiversity, with gender diversity, with intellectual, socioeconomic diversity, racial, gender. And so now we know more. We know more about the wide range of behavior and feelings and emotions and so forth, but we also know about our history and how long it takes to move past some of those internal biases. So we have to be, brave and willing to boldly walk towards our bias and say, I know I have them. That's not going to go away. And you can't clean your house if you don't see the dirt. So I'm going to see the dirt so that I can perhaps, maybe, just maybe interrupt the bias patterns when they come. And you're not a bad person for having bias. If you don't think you have bias, that's a little scary. Of course you do. We experience life as living human beings. And so we're going to be socialized in this world, and we're going to make some assumptions, and those are not going to be correct. We're going to experience things in a particular way that's very different than the way somebody else experiences those things. And we're going to therefore have certain kind of tendencies towards certain kind of thinking. And sometimes it's actually true, and you have to interrupt the bias. Yes. And I use the example of, you may think about going on an airplane, and if you do and you think there's a pilot and a steward or a flight attendant, what do they look like? Most people will say the pilot's a man, the stewardess or the flight attendant is a woman. Now, some of that is a bias, but some of it is our experience and actually the data, which is that you've been on 100 flights and 99 of them had a male pilot. So you expect to see a male pilot in part because of your bias, but also because that's typically what you've seen. So you have to kind of detangle some of that, and it's complicated. And the most important thing is just having an openness to saying, I just want to try to interrupt it. I know I can't stop there from being all these biases. I can't necessarily press the delete button in my brain and in my heart and in my experience in the world, but I can know a little bit more and try to interrupt those patterns when they, emerge.
And I have hope. I mean, I really, truly do, because I imagine it's also more and more people becoming aware and acknowledging a situation is happening, and then educating themselves, having conversations inside the boardroom or inside team meetings or otherwise, and saying, hey, this is how we're going to handle things when it comes up the next time. And then equally, I was in a very interesting meeting a couple of days ago where my father, who is 78, and myself in my mid-40s, and the hospital staff where my mother is staying right now, and literally everything that came out of his mouth was utter mansplaining to them. Telling them, sorry, Dad, but this is what you said, is, things like, well, I know you better than you know yourself. And let me just stop you there because you don't quite understand this yet. And I was like, oh, geez.
I know. And you want to say, yes, Dad, you totally get the experience of being a woman in this country today. I get it. I know it's hard.
It's almost so much, Dr. Kimberly, that if we could rename this episode, How to Simplify, How to Help Mary Tackle Her Dad.
But we all have that. And I'm sure your dad means well, but you have to, again, consider the privilege that has existed, this kind of automatic default for men that has existed for so long. I talk about mansplaining. I wrote a paper on it and I presented it at a conference. And the first example of mansplaining I give is Abigail Adams writing a letter to her husband, John Adams, the second president of the United States, kind of saying, remember the ladies, a very famous letter saying, this is kind of the experience of women. And please make sure, John, because he and her had this really actually very egalitarian relationship for the time, but saying, please do this. And he even said, be sure we've got you. I mean, I'm paraphrasing here, but it was kind of like, don't worry, I've got this covered. And then when you look at the suffragette movement and you see men writing about why women who think they want the right to vote don't really understand the full complexity, and that's not what they really mean. And so this is really a lot of history that we have to combat to a degree, and a lot of privilege, and women just have never, it doesn't occur to us to think that we're going to step in. That's why there is no women-splaining is nonsense, because it wouldn't occur to a woman to say, well, I'm going to come in and commandeer the conversation and be seen as the expert, because when has that ever happened? Mm-hmm. When has that ever been the case? Right. And so it's hard to it's harder sometimes to interrupt that habit, and a person's got to be willing to see it. But we have to be mindful too, to your point of the way we position it to them. So I strongly encourage you to have your dad listen to this episode.
Oh,
Tell
he
him
will.
it's a holiday present to you that he listened to it twice so that he gets a few of the little details, but at least to understand where you're coming from and say, I think separating the individual from the structural problem.
Yes.
If people can take the individual out, it's very, I'm a bad person. I've got these biases. You're saying that I don't, it's all about me. And it's like, no, we're talking about historical, cultural, structural, societal,
Yes.
gender socialization, really very deeply entrenched history kind of things. So, just carry the weight of that on your shoulders. I'd say don't do that. Take it off your shoulders and allow yourself to breathe without the weight of that on your shoulders, whoever you are, man, woman alike. And then maybe you can start to see it with a little bit more objectivity.
Yeah. And so in that meeting, he would say something like that. That was just completely the wrong thing to say. And I would just gently put my hand on his arm and go, I think what he's trying to say here is ... And by the end of the hour-long meeting, we all got on the same page, and he was very grateful and appreciative of the hospital staff that was there. But, I think I've done it. I've accomplished it. I've now pissed off my dad in this conversation, which is great. So now we've moved past that. I want to talk about the how. Like, how do we interrupt this bad behavior? So you have a framework. There are 3 things that you can do to interrupt the bad behavior of mansplaining when it happens to you or even when it happens to someone on your team. So walk us through that.
Absolutely. Yes. And you gave an example of it with your amplification, standing up for others. But I'll start with acknowledgement. And I said earlier, you can't clean your house if you don't see the dirt. So having these discussions and really thinking about the historical context and really being mindful, even if you're the one being mansplained to, that don't let yourself be gaslighted or internalize this. You are experiencing something that has nothing to do with you, and it's not your fault, but it is your problem. So acknowledge that. Okay, so part of it is taking the weight off your shoulders and saying, this isn't even about me. I do have to deal with it. I don't get to kind of step away from it, but it isn't about me. This is about something much bigger than me. It isn't even about my dad or the person on the other side. This is a host of things. And that's why these kind of antecedents are so important. So let's acknowledge what's happening here and try to come in almost with a better sense of how we are here and why we are here, and just taking the weight of the fault and the blame and all of that off the table and just acknowledging it is the truth. And I like to go to the data. The data show that men are seen as the expert. The data show that men interrupt more than women. The data show that the consequences for women are higher. The data show that we are not seen as expert and have to prove it again. There's a theory, prove it again. Women have to prove it again, where men are seen as competent right out of the gate. So the more we know that and we acknowledge it and we understand what's happening, then we come in and we say, okay, I understand the reality. I come in with eyes wide open. Okay.
Yeah. And
I think that's important.
Yeah, that kind of reminds me of that book, The 4 Agreements. Like the first agreement is don't take anything personally. And I think that's to your point there, is that, I was watching how the staff was taking it when they said, when he said something like, I know you better than you know yourself. And it's like, okay, yeah, so he's on the defense right now and wanting to show that he knows what he's talking about and all the things. And so when you have that empathy and compassion, I mean, it really boils down to emotional intelligence. You go, okay, this isn't about me. This is him trying to kind of posture and position himself as someone who knows stuff, right? To be heard and taken seriously, right?
Yeah. And I think also power is so tenuous, and you may not see it as power, but it's like you can't help but notice it's slipping or that it's fleeting. The more you hear Me Too movement, more women in positions of power, more women with voice, more women challenging the status quo, more women like you and I in these kinds of podcasts having these important discussions. You can't help, even if it's on a very unconscious level, to see it happening, right? And so there's that fleeting sense of, unfortunately, almost like power slipping through your fingers, which of course it is not. I always say gender equity is not about you or me. It's about you and me. It's always been about you and me, but it's not always easy to see that. And, the French writer and feminist social activist Simone de Beauvoir famously said in her seminal book, The Second Sex. And I love this quote: "Representation of the world, like the world itself, is the work of men. They describe it from their own point of view, which they confuse with absolute truth." And so think about that. If you've gone unchallenged for almost always, and especially from the other gender, you have not been challenged. And so you have begun to believe at a very core level that the way you are describing it is objective and is the absolute truth. You're confusing it with the absolute truth. And I think that's such a powerful thing. And if we see that and we understand that, it allows us to go, okay, it's not okay, but I kind of see what's happening here. You've mistaken your vantage point for absolute truth because you've been allowed to do so for a very long time. And, you can almost have empathy, like, wow, it must be tough, huh? Letting go as you feel that water, you're squeezing tighter and the water's splashing out because you think you're trying to hold on to it, but you're actually, losing it more quickly. And so I think, yes, acknowledging it and even talking about it in that way. You can say, you're mansplaining to me and so forth. And sometimes you have to do that. You talked about in a workplace, there are times where you have a person who is perhaps a subordinate and you can go, you know what? That's not going to fly.
Yeah.
Let me tell you why it's not going to fly. And I've been there. I've been on that side of the equation. But is the goal to change the behavior or the situation or to flip it to a way that serves you? And for women, what I want is for women to flip it so that it serves us. So when we acknowledge and we understand, perhaps then we present and come to the table with a vantage point that allows us to say the things we need to say in a way that's a bit more palatable and more likely to be taken in and not kind of, I'm turning you off because I feel like you're saying I'm a bad person and all of those things. And I think some of that. So what I would say is, Mary's dad, you are not a bad person. This is what's going on, Dad. And I'm sure it's difficult, but we're just trying to have a voice and we're trying to talk about our lived experience as women. And we want our experience to be non-invisible experiences. And the distortion of women's experiences happen in ways that are relevant to creating inequity in equal position for women. And so if we don't grab hold of our own experience, then we continue to perpetuate our unequal social position in the world. And so even a little thing like that dinner conversation to a lot of us is bigger. It really means something more. So the first thing is, number one, I call it the 3 A's of dealing with bad behavior, bad male behavior. One, acknowledgement. You can't clean your house if you don't see the dirt, and you have to understand things in the full complexity. If we oversimplify, and I know this is about simplifying, but it's not about oversimplifying.
Right.
And if you oversimplify, then you miss some important components, right?
Yeah.
The second, sorry.
So
please.
I want to pause you there because I think this is really, really important. Again, if you or someone on your team doesn't acknowledge it, I think that's incredibly important because I can think back to when I was parenting young children and reading all the books. So, one parenting technique is if a child has bad behavior, if you ignore it, then they don't get rewarded with attention for, having a meltdown or whatever. But I think in this situation, you really have to acknowledge it. If bad behavior keeps happening over and over and over again in the boardroom, in a pitch meeting, in wherever, and everybody just pretends it's not happening, I think that can be incredibly toxic to your company culture. And you run the risk of losing quality talent on your team because, hey, guess what? People will just leave. They will find a better job.
And the environment, you're creating an environment that is not conducive to the success of all, which means not the environment where overall you're going to be as successful as you could be.
Absolutely. And I think that if a person gets away with it enough times, it becomes bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, the actual bad behavior, because they don't know any different. They don't know that it's not appropriate to say things like that or that they can be interpreted in the wrong way.
Yeah. I agree with you. So some of it's in interrupting and some of it's honest mistakes as you're saying they don't get it. And some of it's gaslighting.
Yes.
Some of it's saying the inappropriate thing. And then you are made to feel like you're sensitive, right? And I really have a problem with that more than almost anything, which is, own it, okay? You said it, own it. And so I do think one of the ways that we can address that in a great way is through the second A, which is amplification. Having partners, others, allies with you in the room who help do that, who help to amplify. And here's a great example. Mary's sitting in a room and she has an idea. And John says, you know what? I don't understand what you're saying or whatever. And so you move on. And then a few minutes later, maybe nobody says anything. The idea just lands and fizzles and nothing happens. Nobody glums on or people discount it. A few minutes later, Tony jumps in and says, I've got this idea. And it's Mary's idea, basically. He's bropriating or heap-eating, as we call it, your idea. These are real things that happen, right? These are just fun and easy ways. You have been bropriated. They're heap-eating what you're saying. This is what's going on. And you can kind of sit there and go, what the heck is happening? And we've all seen this. I'm sorry, women, every person listening has sat in a room and said, is this thing on? Like, I thought that's what I just said. But if then Kimberly comes in and says, wait a minute, Tony, let me just stop you for a second. I feel like what you're saying is what Mary just said, but maybe I'm misunderstanding, and I don't want to misunderstand. So are you saying what she just said, or are you saying something different? Yes. Now, I haven't called him out in a way that's perhaps, going to offend him, or, he's my boss or whatever, but I've kind of almost inquisitively come in and said, hey, wait a minute. I feel like that's what Mary said. Maybe I'm misunderstanding.
Right.
Perhaps I don't see it, but of course I totally understand. So as much as we can do that, and I would argue, find people to come in the room with you and agree in advance. This is coming. I love to tell people, forewarned is forearmed. Come in prepared for it to happen. Walk in expecting it, and have your allies and or your retorts prepared. Be prepared for the person in the room who is going to either try to gaslight you or interrupt you or kind of take the stage away from you and flip the power so that they're the dominant power within the conversation. And be ready with whether it's your pithy comments or your logical data points. And, when I talk about gaslighting, when people say things like, calm down, to women, and you're like, I'm super calm right now, so I don't know why you're saying that. Or, I was in a meeting once where someone said to me, well, you're being defensive, right? And it's kind of that scapegoat, right? And I said, oh, no, I'm not being defensive. I'm being defending. Defensive is not listening to your point and just kind of screaming mine. Defending is I'm listening to your point and providing counterpoints to illustrate my point. And those are different things. And to kind of interrupt that language and say, I don't have to accept the narrative that you are putting forward. Yeah. So if you put forward the narrative, oh, you're just being sensitive. I don't think I am being sensitive. I think this is really more about appropriate interactions. Or I understand that you may not agree, but I think in fairness, I should be allowed to tell you that I don't appreciate the way that's happening. Yeah. I understand that it's not something that makes you uncomfortable, but it does make me uncomfortable. Or, hey, John, I don't know if you saw in that last meeting to your boss, but this happened. And I had that happen before where I heard a man, older white gentleman, screaming at his boss in the hallway about something that was bothering him. And when it was over, I kind of went up to the boss. I went up to the man and said, I just have to say this. I can't help myself. It has nothing to do with me. But if that had been a woman, that could have been so distressful to their career, so hindering to their career. And if that had been a woman of color, it would have probably been career destroying. And so just when you're not having skin in the game, to jump in and say, well, I can say this to this person. I can be this amplifier, this person who does that. So we can all amplify others. We don't have to know people to amplify them. We don't have to be in it to amplify them. And when we are in it, we have to take those opportunities. We have to be ready for them. We have to be prepared for them to come. We have to expect them so that when they come, we are there and able to be allies and amplifiers, right?
Yeah. And what I hear in all of that is it takes courage. Bottom line, it takes courage. If you witness a car accident, do you drive on? Do you stop and make sure everybody's okay? Do you point out that what you saw, heard, and all the things is relayed over as truth? And I think we're in a day and age when something super awkward happens in a conversation that you're either a passerby or you are actively involved in. Our immediate inclination is to do just this. Look at my phone, pretend it's not happening, pretend I'm not a part of this.
Absolutely.
And kind of move on because I'm so quote unquote busy. But I think it requires courage to go, hang on, pause. No, actually, and go from there.
It's a call to action to be an upstander versus a bystander. And I think it's having an honest conversation with yourself. In what ways measurably have I been an upstander?
Yeah.
If we challenge ourselves to that question, I mean, literally, if your male allies say, because allyship is my third A of dealing with this behavior, and when male allies say, what can I do? My first question is, tell me 3 ways you were an upstander. I don't want to know philosophically how you feel. I appreciate your cheerleading on the inside and your desire subconsciously or on a very philosophical level for things to be better. What 3 concrete things did you do this week to be an upstander versus a bystander? And if you can't think of any, let's try to change that so that next time we talk, you've got some specific ways that you can show and talk about how you have been an ally, have been part of the solution, and have been there with, being an upstander for the people that you claim to. This is about walking the talk. You want to be on the right side of this, then you have to walk the talk. And that's about measurable action that you can point to and say, this is what I am doing, not this is what I'm feeling, because the feelings are only as important as they inspire you to act in ways that help create a better situation.
I love it. So acknowledgement, amplification, and allyship. And, as you were kind of breaking it down there, it's so practical and so great to really break it down and simplify in that way. It made me kind of think, as a challenge to whoever's listening right now, if you manage a team, I would assign your team to listen to this podcast, and you guys have an open and earnest conversation at your next team meeting or quarterly retreat. Because I think sometimes we think as allies that, oh yeah, that doesn't happen here. We're good. But reality is different people in different roles, from management to intern, are having completely different experiences inside the company and outside, interfacing with clients. That I think it would be a great challenge to listen to the podcast, come together as a team and say, hey, what is your experience? Are you seeing this? Are you not? That could make some real positive change.
Yeah, when we look for things, we see them, good or bad. If we look for people to disappoint us, they often do.
Yes.
If we look for people to succeed, they often do. And so if we look for mansplaining, gaslighting, bropriating, heap-eating, I assure you, you will see it if you look purposely for it.
Yeah.
You will absolutely see it if you look for it. And so I do think that that's really important to do. I think it's really important to say, we have to think about that. And this is what I like to say to people who say, well, it's not like that here. It's exactly like that here. Trust me.
Yeah.
Not every day, not all the time. But no matter what you believe, it is exactly like that, sometimes for somebody here.
Right.
And if you have that mindset, then you'll see it. And if you see it, maybe you can interrupt it, because that's really what it's about, interrupting those negative patterns that keep women from advancing to the degree and experiencing the success that you would expect in a world where so many women are getting advanced degrees and running businesses and working so hard to transcend barriers, that you would expect to start seeing this change happen. And so it's very clear that we need all hands on deck here, my friend, if we're going to make this happen.
Yeah. And I know that a lot of our listeners are female and small business owners around the world. And let's just take it from the example of, say, a wedding planner, right? And if you are a wedding planner out there, maybe this would relate to you, but you think about the different types of people you come in contact with any given workday or week. It might be pitching a prospective client, a bride and groom or otherwise, that are wanting to hire you as their planner. Or you might be dealing with vendors and suppliers on your preferred vendor list, or maybe brand news who want to get on that list. But then also you might encounter mansplaining inside your team, whether it is a manager on your team that you have hired to manage your planners, or a subordinate or an intern that comes in very entitled and privileged and just coming with a real edge that doesn't mix with the team itself. So kind of breaking that down as a case study, what would you suggest as like subtle nuances to how you respond to each of those 3 types of people?
Yeah. Well, the first thing I would say is you got to get your head right. Mindset, okay? So you've got to see what's happening, and you've got to take a step back, and you've got to realize what's happening.
Yep.
So what's happening here? Are they mansplaining to me? Are they gaslighting me and trying to make me think that I'm being overly sensitive when they're the one who's actually really upset? Or, what's going on here? And like you said, what is the power dynamic? Because if you're in a position of power, honestly, I'd say that's simple. Like, call it like that is your job, and you are in a wonderful position to teach and to mentor that person to understand. And if they don't understand, to say, you may not perceive this, you may not see this, but let me help you understand. And here's why. With some people, maybe it's a colleague, same kind of thing. You can use humor. If you're funny, use humor. Wow, I had no idea, given that I'm the one with the PhD in leadership here, that you with your master's degree in art history were so knowledgeable of this. So you can kind of be tongue in cheek and joke in certain cases and know you can get away with it. And that's when you're dealing with a person who doesn't actually realize they're doing it, because sometimes they just don't think and they just jump in and they say something and they don't realize. And you're like, let me just remind everyone who the expert is here. Yeah. Sometimes if it's a vendor or a person you're working with, I like to ask them a question they can't answer. Sometimes you have to just put a stopper in. So you ask a question based on what's happening where you actually have a boatload of expertise and they have none. And when they sputter and pause and cannot answer the question, you might interrupt and say, I do have some ideas for this if you're wondering. And you just move the conversation, because somehow the snowball has gone down the hill that they know as much as you and they don't. Yeah. So you've got to just you put your boot in the snow there and say, I've got to interrupt this. And instead of saying, I know how to do my job, or being defensive, which is not going to go well, it's about jumping in with a question they can't answer or an insight they don't have. And then the next thing is, I love data. Have the data points, have the research. I know, I thought that too. But then I did this research and I found that, and I used to experience that in my corporate America days. You'd go to talk to a buyer, and I know that when I tried to tell them that they should look at something a particular way, they were going to push back. And I knew they were going to push back, and I knew they were wrong, but they were ultimately the gatekeeper. So I'd have that data. And when they did that, I'd go, I thought the same thing. I agree with you. I'm not surprised that you would say that. It's so strange. We did this study with 500 potential buyers, and 490 of them actually preferred this. And so having the data, and remember, you actually are the expert. That's the biggest thing. Don't allow yourself to be gaslighted and to buy into the nonsense. You've got to interrupt and go, hold on. I'm starting to get imposter syndrome here. I'm starting to question, they're making it seem like, well, I don't understand what you're saying. And a lot of times with mansplaining, it's like, oh, you're making it overly complicated. It's like, I'm not at all making it overly complicated, right? Yeah. I don't need you to come in and rescue me here, but to just say, okay, I hear what you're saying, but then what about the thing they can't answer? So sometimes I think it's just sitting there, and I do think come in with your pithy comments. If you know that this is a person who's always going to interrupt you, you've got all the way till the next meeting to come up with your zinger, your very pithy, intelligent, non-offensive. And should you have to? Absolutely not. Is it fair? Not at all. Is it totally inequitable and nonsense that we as women have to do this constantly? Is it exhausting? And does it take incredible emotional labor? It sure does. That said, this is where we're at, right? So it's not your fault, but it is your problem. And really what this is about taking back your narrative and control of the situation in a way that serves you. Because it's not about power. It's not about saying you take the power from them. It's about saying, how can I move this conversation so that it serves me better? Yeah. Because right now it's going in a path that does not serve me. Yeah. So I can't allow that to continue. As soon as I recognize that this conversation is no longer serving me as the expert, and therefore not you as the person who needs the expert, I'm going to go ahead and interrupt that. And sometimes it's saying, it feels like we've come to a place where we need to take a little time and consider each other's. Why don't I send you an email with a few comments about what we've thought about it, and take a second? Because when you take people sometimes out of the situation and then they have a little time later, sometimes you just can't get there in that moment, and you've just got to move. You got to put a pin in it. You got to just say, we're going to put a pin in this. Even if it's gotten really where the person's yelling, or, you feel like, or they're saying, you're not calm. I feel like I'm calm, but if you don't, it probably makes sense. If you don't feel I'm calm, why don't we take a minute then and put a pause in this and come back when we're both feeling a little bit more like.
I love it.
on from there.
And these are all fantastic strategies to help you like avoid getting flustered when it happens. It's not if it happens, but when it happens. And I just love that. And I want to repeat what you said there. Expect it. It's coming down the pipeline. So being prepared with those pithy retorts that aren't super offensive. I love the one of like, oh, if somebody points out a spelling error, you could just say, well, next time I want you to proofread all of my decks and I'll kick this over to you. You be my personal secretary. How about that?
Right. It points out how absurd it is that you actually made the comment to a degree, right?
Yeah. And in the end, as you say, like it really gives you the power to flip it. Because I think what happens is sometimes those are like poking the bear. It's trying to get a response from you to throw you off your game, if you will. So if you can stay calm, cool, collected, and respectful in conversation, you don't sink down to their level. You rise above, right?
Well, and I said before, this is what you have to always remember. If you go toe to toe, it does not land the same. No. You will be more highly penalized. You will be more highly judged. Yep. You will be more highly criticized in the moment and by anyone seeing it. Yep. So knowing that you've got to go in with eyes wide open and be ready to take that higher road, whether you should have to or not, whether it's fair or not, as we said, no, but the reality is the reality. And so you have to know it.
Mm-hmm, totally. And, to point back to what we talked about earlier of like a prospective client comes to you in a pitch meeting, let's say, and is mansplaining. Hey, guess what? You own the business, which means you don't have to take on that client. That's end of, boundaries set. We're not a right match for you. But
especially if it's never going to change.
Never.
There comes a time where you just have to say to yourself, this investment is no longer worth it for me. It no longer serves me, and it is no longer viable.
That's right. Yes. And you don't have to accept that business. You can refer them to others or just say, this is not a match. If it's a vendor or supplier, either on your preferred list or one that's pitching to be so, and you notice that they're doing this front facing with your clients, that's a big problem because that vendor and supplier is in essence a representation of you, your brand, and your relationship with the client. It's a no-go. You educate, you mention it, but if it is continually chronically happening, then you again, as a business owner, have the choice to stop that relationship.
And for those who are new to business and thinking, I can't turn away clients, I can't afford to turn away clients, I've got to take it. I think it's hard sometimes to realize that we teach people very early on what we're going to accept, and it's only going to get worse. So it is hard. It is so hard to do what you're saying sometimes when you're struggling and you're building and you're trying to build.
Yes.
But it's short-term gain, long-term loss is something all business owners need to be careful of. And if you take the short-term game of letting people know that you can be treated a particular way or that a particular set of behaviors that is inequitable to you and unfair to women in general is going to be allowed, then in the long term, that's going to have a more detrimental effect. So sometimes seeing, a few chess moves ahead and understanding that the short-term gain is not worth the long-term loss.
Yes.
And that's not easy to do. I get it, but you're right. You have to.
Yes, 100%. And so again, coming back to what if it is a team member or a subordinate, somebody who you manage, nip it in the bud immediately, have those private conversations so that you're not shaming them publicly for bad behaviors. Private conversations, acknowledging it, coming together and talking solutions. And then I think most importantly, setting a time to come back and review progress. Has it gotten better? Has it gotten worse? Or has it stayed the same? And what are we going to do about it? Because I think there can be a lot of lip service to this and like, oh, yeah, we should do something about it. But then nothing gets done or we're not tracking the progress. And again,
and that which gets measured gets done.
100%.
If we are not measuring and we are not concrete looking, and this is what I'm saying about how people feel. Mm-hmm. If I came to you and say, I don't feel like you've got my back, let's say to my boss, or people keep interrupting in meetings, and it's very hard for me because they're my superiors, but you're my boss. Can you have my back here? Yes. Oh, yeah, I've got your back. And then later going back and saying, tell me about ways you think you've had my back because I still don't feel it. I know you don't mean, or even just saying sometimes, I'm sure you didn't mean this, but I'm not sure if you realize that you did this thing. sometimes is a way that people can. I've had a lot of success with going, I don't think you meant to do this, but, and especially in amplification, I'm not sure if you realize that you did this to Heather, but it kind of came across this way. And I know you didn't mean it to, so I just wanted to let you know, because I know you're an ally and you'd want to know.
Yeah. Oh, God, so much here. Dr. DeSimone, I'm so pleased that you've come on to our podcast to really simplify not an easy topic. And if you guys are curious about the work that she does in the world, I highly, highly recommend you check out her podcast as well. You can find it over at advancingwomenpodcast.com. All the links are in the show notes, all the resources, everything we talked about today. You can find that over at the simplifierspodcast.com. And again, put it as a challenge back to your team. Have them listen to this, have a conversation, talk it through. You might be quite surprised to hear their feedback as well. So, Dr. Kimberly, I have a few questions as we wrap up. And again, thank you so much for your time today.
It's been a blast. I've had so much fun. What a great way to spend an afternoon.
Love it. So my first question for you today is this. What's one book or blog that you're reading these days that's either inspiring you or poking holes and challenging your belief system?
Okay, so I'm reading a book right now that's doing both. It is challenging me and poking holes in my belief system, but also really inspiring me. And it's called Data Bias in a World Designed for Men by Caroline Creato Perez. And all I'm going to tell you is this. She wields data like a true warrior. I mean, I listen to what she says in this and the history and the way data has been kind of absent of the experience of women. And I think, wow, this is really telling if we look at all the different ways that is happening. And so that has been very inspiring and really making me think a lot lately.
Love it. God, I haven't heard that book. So we'll link that up in the show notes if people are curious about that one as well. So tell us, who's one person, somebody that you know personally in your network that you just feel is up to brilliant things? We could shine a spotlight on them. And who knows, maybe one day we'll have them on the podcast.
Yeah, I love that you say brilliant too, because research shows that the word brilliant is often only used to describe men.
Not true.
And it's, of course, it is not true. There's many, many brilliant women. We're surrounded by them. I'm in a conversation with one right now. But I will say that we have to use those words. So I love that. And I have a lot of good friends that come to mind. But when I think about another podcaster who has a great podcast, it's Dr. Pat Sanders. And she has This Prof Life. And she's a professor. And she looks at the experience of women of color and the kind of intersectionality of all of this, whether it's gender, but also the experience of, BIPOC community and those types of people. So I think she's a good person to listen to. And because she interviews women in higher education, she has a lot of science and data-driven evidence to give us that data point that we need to fight that battle in a way that allows us to be most persuasive. So I think she's a good one to check out. And I enjoy listening to her podcast.
I love it. Well, we will link her up in the show notes for people as well. So if you guys are curious about the work that they're doing in the world, over again at the simplifierspodcast.com. So I believe that gratitude and simplicity go hand in hand. Tell me, what's one thing you're grateful for today?
Okay, so I often say that if you sit with warriors, the conversation is different. And I start my podcast every week with Welcome Warriors, because we have so many biases and barriers and fallacies and assumptions that we have to overcome. And we are warriors. And I encourage and challenge people to always sit with warriors. But I am incredibly grateful, beyond grateful, for the warrior women who support me, who sit in rooms with me and push me to think more intellectually, to think bigger, to think about bigger ideas, but who also support me and have my back, my persisterhood of warrior women. I guess I'm very grateful for them.
Love it. Well, again, I'll link up all of your social media channels in our show notes. So if people want to connect with you directly there, they can find you like on Instagram and Facebook. Advancing Women Podcast is her handle. But my final question for you today is this. Someone somewhere is listening to you and I right now, and she just came out of a meeting where there was total mansplaining. It kicked her off of her game completely. She got flustered, and she just is like ready to throw her hands up and put in her resignation. What's one thing you could whisper into her ear right now just to encourage her in this moment?
Okay. It's not your fault. don't beat yourself up and don't spend a lot of time thinking of all the ways you should have said, could have said, and didn't say when somebody else did the wrong thing. Yeah. Don't do that.
Yeah. And if it's my dad, I'm so sorry. I think what he's trying to say here is
what he meant to say.
Dr. Kimberly, thank you so much for your time today.
It's been delightful. Thank you.